Hi there, my name is Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. In my last video, I discussed the 1979 Stephen King novel, The Dead Zone, and in this video, I will be taking a look at the 1983 feature film adaptation of the novel. During the 80s, there were 15 Stephen King movies made. 15! And many of them, in my honest opinion, weren't very good. Whether they suffered from inept acting, poorly executed special effects, budgetary constraints, or were just corny as hell, the majority of 80s King adaptations are simply not among my favorites. Of the 15 King movies from the 80s, I only enjoy maybe 4 or 5 of them, but The Dead Zone, while seemingly not suffering from any of the aforementioned pitfalls, at least not blatantly, still didn't manage to rise to the level of a King movie classic for me personally. History and background. It seems like the path to any King film being created is a long and arduous journey, and The Dead Zone is no exception. The film began its roundabout way to existence immediately following the publication of the novel in 1979, and what followed was a cavalcade of producers, studios, directors, and actors being changed, hired, fired, then rehired and recast, while scripts were written, scrapped, rewritten, and thoroughly edited numerous times by numerous people. Eventually, the details were hashed out, and the core team that would bring The Dead Zone to the big screen was determined. That team included producers Dino De Laurentiis, who would go on to produce numerous additional King movies, and Deborah Hill, who is best known for her work on the Halloween franchise. Additionally, David Cronenberg, of The Fly and Videodrome fame, was brought in to direct, and Jeffrey Boehm, best known for his work on The Lost Boys and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, would write the screenplay. Anyway, filming began in January of 1983 in Canada during what David Cronenberg would call a relentless deep freeze that went on for weeks. While it made for an authentic atmosphere, the climate was uncomfortable and nearly intolerable for the cast and crew. While Christopher Walken would ultimately end up in the role of John Smith, the story's lead protagonist, actor and absolute legend Bill Murray, had initially been considered for the role, and apparently he was King's first choice. Frankly, I'm not sure how well that would have worked, but when I think of Bill Murray and Christopher Walken, I can't think of two actors whose personas and filmographies could possibly be more opposite one another. I've always thought of Murray as a light-hearted, witty goofball, while Walken has always seemed so intense and brooding and pretty scary, honestly. That is until his marathon dance performance in the video for Fatboy Slim's Weapon of Choice, which, if you haven't seen this video, you really should check it out. Link in the description. Frankly, I didn't find Walken to be a great casting choice. Don't get me wrong, I've enjoyed his acting in numerous films, but he didn't feel right to me as John Smith. Just my opinion. Ratings and critical reception. The initial response to the film from critics at the time of the film's release was predominantly positive. Roger Ebert praised Cronenberg's direction for successfully weaving the supernatural into the everyday and noted believable performances by the entire cast, especially Walken, writing, quote, "Walken does such a good job of portraying Johnny Smith, the man with the strange gift, that we forget this is science fiction or fantasy or whatever and just accept it as this guy's story," unquote. Janet Maslin of the New York Times referred to the film as, quote, "a well-acted drama, more eerie than terrifying, more rooted in the occult than in sheer horror," unquote. Currently, the film holds an 89% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is extremely high for a King adaptation. The site's consensus reads, quote, "The Dead Zone combines taut direction from David Cronenberg and a rich performance from Christopher Walken to create one of the strongest Stephen King adaptations," unquote. Is it by the book? As is customary of many a King movie, the basic premise of the story remains intact, while some either arbitrary changes or perhaps changes made out of necessity due to location, weather, budget, etc. are made, and the Dead Zone makes numerous changes right out of the gate. Within the first 10 minutes of the movie, we see numerous changes to the story. Most are inconsequential changes. Most are inconsequential changes, like a town carnival being replaced with a roller coaster, and a taxicab involved in a head-on collision with another speeding car is replaced with a VW Bug colliding with an overturned milk truck, and a few additional minor alterations. While the means are different, the end result is essentially the same. However, there are some major omissions made that I felt took a lot of context, severity, and consequence away from the story. For example, John Smith's childhood trauma or any allusion to the fact that Johnny already had a less pronounced cognitive ability prior to his accident are absent from the film. In the book, the reader understands that Johnny has had certain abilities and intuitions for many years, and that the car accident is the catalyst that pushes his abilities beyond that of mere intuitiveness. In the film, his abilities appear to be the direct result of the injuries he sustained in the accident, with no precedent or presupposition. These abilities of precognition just appear to come out of nowhere. But this omission is hardly the most glaring flaw of the adaptation. The major fault of this movie is that the backstory of the main antagonist, Greg Stilson, who is played by Martin Sheen, is omitted entirely, which leads to one substantial, irreconcilable problem for me. In the novel, King goes to great lengths to detail and portray Stilson as an inhumane, destructive, self-serving swindler. The scene in which we are introduced to Stilson in the novel is honestly one of the most memorable, traumatic scenes from the story. It gives the reader no illusions about who this man is and tells us right up front that he is indeed a monster. And through continued explorations of Stilson's sordid past, King reinforces this initial characterization throughout the novel. In the movie, while we are briefly introduced to Stilson in glimpses and asides, it's not until nearly an hour into the film that we begin to see that he is yet another corrupt politician. And that is the apex of failure in Cronenberg's film for me. In the novel, Stilson is anything but just another corrupt politician. King portrays him not only as an inhumane monster, but as a showman, as a political anomaly, and the furthest thing from your typical Republican candidate. In the movie, Stilson comes off as any old blowhard who is no better or worse than what one would expect from a rising politician. Sure, he is corrupt, but how is that in any way unconventional, especially in relation to the politics of the United States? And it is for these reasons, the omission of Stilson's backstory and his more generic politician's demeanor, that when Johnny decides that Stilson is dangerous to the safety and continued survival of humanity and that he must act to stop Stilson, it doesn't feel justified or legitimate as it does in the book. Johnny's decision to take action seems extreme, and the viewer isn't convinced that it is in fact the right thing to do. We are given one scene in which Stilson is portrayed as legitimately dangerous, at which point we are nearly at the climax of the film, but King's tactic of showing us more of Stilson's behaviors over the course of the entire story is far more effective in allowing the reader or viewer to accept and agree to what Johnny feels must be done. Regardless of the audience's foreknowledge that Johnny does have this precognitive gift, Stilson's character isn't exposed or explored to the point that what Johnny has planned feels like it is a reasonable option or that it should be considered his only possible course of action. As a result, Johnny doesn't feel like the hero of this movie at the end, at least not to me. He feels a bit like an unhinged, immoral character whose judgment may not be entirely sound, which is not at all who we felt he was in the book. In the book, we understand that Johnny is conflicted about the decision he has made, but that he is left with no choice. While in the movie, it seems to the viewer that Johnny defaults to the most radical action available to him without even considering his options or experiencing a crisis of conscience, and that is enough, at least from my perspective, to have lost sight of the story's premise entirely. Final thoughts. This movie had a lot going for it, and while it is one of the less cringy movies to come out of the initial King content adaptation craze, the screenplay left out what, to me, were some of the most important elements of the story. King is known for his extensive character development, and I'm willing to admit that on occasion, King can be descriptive to a fault. But when you strip away the build-up and remove focus from key details, you inevitably sacrifice the emotional components required to elicit the desired response from the audience. Had the movie spent more time on Stillson and his story arc, I have no doubt this movie would have been far more effective and impactful. Alright, in the next video in this series, I'll be taking a look at the TV series adaptation of The Dead Zone, which, having already watched the first episode, I regret to say that I am not excited that there are somehow 6 seasons of this show, some of which have as many as 19 episodes in them. Dear God. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so be sure to smoosh that subscribe bell with your hand fingers to follow my journey through the endless bog crowded with bloated King content carcasses. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.